debt crisis in Africa as the UN has warned that the growing debt crisis in Africa could lead to social unrest. As a solution to the debt issues in Africa, there's been call for debt relief. Will it be possible for many African countries that are burdened by huge debt to have relief from their creditors? Well, Fidelis Atabo, who is a development economist and a banking expert, joins us this morning virtually from Nasarawa State. Good morning, Fidelis.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
All right, let's see if we can get to the genesis of this problem. How did it happen that many African countries at the same time are heavily burdened with debts?
All right, thank you very much. If you really want to look at it very well, the whole thing started from the disruption arose from the incidents of COVID-19 pandemic in 2019, late 2019 up to 2020. There was a disruption in the global economy, and then that led to shocks, most especially in terms of supply. This global distortion, was not really taken very serious, so to say, by African countries, because it is in African countries you see people believe that COVID-19 pandemic does not even exist in the first place. And if it does not exist in the first place, how do you find a way to see how the effects or the disaster, can be mitigated to be able to bring in the expected future gains that the economy is supposed to make? These things were not really given due attention from the African continent, and then because of that, we saw that some of the needed steps that were supposed to be taken by the continents were not really taken. And at the end of the day, the effect of COVID-19, started having inroads into Africa in terms of reducing growth, and then productivity also was also affected. And when productivity is affected, you discover that the capacity to make repayments in terms of loan also is being weakened. And if it is weakened, it becomes difficult for African countries to keep to their loan promises. And I think these are the things that actually led to some of these issues that has made it very difficult for African continents to repay their loans. And it started dovetailing into low productivity and low welfare, which is actually leading into some setting of unrest that we are beginning to see in Africa now. So I think Africa did not do well in terms of post-COVID-19 steps that we're supposed to take to be able to restore productivity and to be able to grow the economies as expected. So it makes the productive capacity very weak, and then it became difficult to pay the loan. The repayment became very difficult for African countries. And then, just as I said earlier, government was battling with low repayments, so it became difficult for government also to embark on social economic activities that will bring succor to the people in the African continent. So this is a similar reason that actually affected the African continent in terms of low repayment that has brought them to this high level of indebtedness now that is actually becoming very difficult, and they are seeking for some level of debt forgiveness, which we will get to that as we move on. Thank you very much.
All right, Fidelis, good to see you again. On a situation like this, it's usually something that calls for concern. But I would like you, I heard you attributed some of this situation to COVID-19 and the Russian invasion and all that, the crisis over there. But if you look at some of the reasons you've highlighted, they are not so exclusive to the African climate. Other continents are also affected. But why do you think Africa is still battling with severe debt, even years after this crisis, talking about COVID-19? And then I would like you to react specifically to what the United Nations Secretary General said. He used the word unsustainable and then a recipe for social unrest. So how will the debt crisis in Africa lead to social unrest? And how sustainable looking at the present situation? Talk to us, please.
All right, thank you very much. The assertion by the UN reps, I think, is not limited to only African continents. If actually we want to look at it holistically, it is important to note that it's not peculiar to Africa, as I said. Any continent that is witnessed or is witnessing high debt level can have a similar crisis in terms of social unrest that we have in African continent majorly now. So it is not actually an African thing, but is a function of the level of debt that is actually leading to this, because government is no longer being able to embark on their social economic activities to bring succor to the people, as I said earlier. This also has, how do I call it, a correspondence with what Nkoje Iweala, the former finance minister of Nigeria and the former managing director of the World Bank, she also said that, when debt level become very high, it can lead to what? Austerity measures, which can exacerbate social tension and lead to unrest. When there are austerity measures, just as you rightly put, you discover that government is trying to cut down on expenditure, government is trying to make adjustment of spending, and then it brings about limited resources. The IMF managing director also contributed to this, Christina Genevia. She also contributed to this also. In her own case, she tried to look at it that high debt level can limit government's ability to respond to social and economic challenges, which can also lead to social unrest. That was what she also said. So having looked at this, it is obvious that debt level, has a lot to do in terms of wellness of economy, in terms of well-being of economy, and in terms of welfare of people in a particular country or continent, as the case may be. And then this issue of unrest is not actually what we should take with levity. What leads to social unrest if there is high debt rates? It is when government find it difficult to spend on social services and infrastructural development. It becomes very difficult for citizens to enjoy some level of infrastructure. It begins to heighten some level of stress and poverty, as the case may be. At this time too, one of the things that comes with this kind of high level of debt, that African countries are facing, there will be increase in taxes. Once there are increase in taxes, it becomes very difficult even for companies too, and even manufacturing companies too. It also affects their profitability, because government is trying one way or the other to see how they can generate income. We will also see something like economic instability and reduce economic growth when there is high level of debt, because government will no longer invest in productive activities that will increase the income generation at all levels to dovetail into growth in GDP. These are actually some of the things, and all these that I have mentioned can culminate into inequality and poverty. Because if this is being put in place, if this is being witnessed in an economy, the government becomes very slim in terms of resources to be able to take care of the social responsibility and poverty concerns issues as regards the citizen. And all this will lead to social tension and unrest because there's going to be crisis. Because one, the welfare has been hampered, the purchasing power has been hampered, and then people find it difficult to have some level of social benefits, and they begin to see how they can actually sort themselves out in an economy. And everybody wants to survive. So every means they embark upon, to them, may be legitimate or maybe genuine rather, but in the face of law and in the face of policy, their actions may hamper other agents in the economy. And that is how it affects the entire economy in terms of productivity. And then if it is not being attended to, it can actually bring about issues of slow growth in terms of GDP and slow growth in terms of economic activities that can also bring things like unemployment, banditry, and all other vices that you may think of, even protests on the streets. So these are actually the things that can propel it. When government is being limited with slim resources to be able to embark on socio-economic activities that can actually bring relief to the people due to quantum loan that has been taken. So government concentrate more on loan repayment at the detriment of actually the citizens, which is not a good thing, because when we are talking about sustainability, is actually the function of being able to make or embark on loan repayments and also not allow that to hamper with your core responsibilities and deliverables in terms of the welfare of the people. So if this is being allowed, you discover that priorities to loan repayments may actually hamper welfare. And if it hampers welfare, it's really going to lead into, or which has actually led into social unrest that we are witnessing across African countries. I think it is high time African countries have to embark on, African continents have to embark on a kind of a redefined economy that can actually look into the kind of facilities they have obtained so far, and then what they are to do, which was the bane of the African-China bilateral summit that took place in Beijing, where we saw the Africans being given opportunity to obtain a whopping sum of 51 billion naira in form of a bilateral relationship between China and African continent. Our African continents will also need to look at this very well in terms of the conditions that comes with it. And why are they giving them this 51 billion naira? And the 51 billion naira is quite different from what has been given to Africa long before now. What China was doing with Africa was more of a support in terms of aids. And when you are giving aids to a nation, it's actually different from when there's a bilateral agreement and bilateral business support to a nation. And then the difference is that if it is bilateral, it makes it better because it's going to be a win-win situation for both parties involved. That is why about 50 African countries were there in Beijing, and they actually gave a nod to it that yes, it is high time they actually look into the economy. And this funds that is going to be given to them, is no longer business as usual, where you give funds to them, to the African continent, and then you allow them manage these funds. Part of this fund is going to come in terms of credit facilities to African countries, which you have about 29 billion US dollars will come in terms of credit facilities. Then we have about 9.9 billion that will also come in terms of investments, where we have Chinese investors coming into Africa to invest. And why are they coming to invest? It is because they have the efficiency, the efficiency and the technology, that requires in terms of services and manufacturing, and that is why they are actually coming to invest this in Africa. And by so doing, it is also coming with huge lots of employment generation. Employment generation in the sense that some of these processed products, goods, record have also shown in the summit that China has done more of exportation, of their unfinished products into African continent. And the implication is that what we are exporting from here, into China is far lower than what we are importing. And the implication is that we are actually creating room for low job creation. So they are now saying that, okay, African continents put together, they are indebted to China up to 30 billion US dollars, which some of these are stressed. Some are not performing. They are non-performing loans. Some are actually finding it difficult. So if you look at this 30 billion, the model that wants to be adopted from this summit is that, okay, your production capacity is weak in Africa. You are owing 30 billion US dollars. There is social unrest. How do you pay this money? So they now looked at it that, okay, the best option and the best model to use is to improve the productive capacity of Africa by injecting another 51 billion US dollars to be able to enable them return back to maximum productive capacity to be able to pay these loans, both the credit lines that will be taken and then the backlog of 30 billion that is being owned by African countries. So you can see that it is.
All right, Fidelis, we're already looking, you're already talking about what China has done so far in Africa. So at the China-Africa Summit, where the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was speaking and actually giving this warning that the debt crisis in Africa could lead to social unrest, he actually commended the initiative of China in Africa and actually asked that China should do a renewable energy revolution drive in Africa and also get into key food systems while also trying to improve digital connectivity. Now, from what China has done so far, which according to you, you say that there's been more of exports from China into Africa, and in a trade between China and Africa, there's still a deficit because what Africa exports to China is less than what it imports from China. Given all of this and the appraisal and even recommendation of the UN Secretary General to China, what is your take in this, and what do you think Africa can do with what the UN Secretary General is recommending, renewable energy revolution and key food systems to be provided by, say, China?
All right, thank you very much. You see, the renewable energy position, we have about 30 solar energy initiatives that will be launched in Beijing from these arrangements. And this solar energy, in their characteristic manner, will also be exported, into African continents. And then the solar energy and the solar green energy concerns that will come into African continent is actually going to reduce overhead costs in terms of doing business. What I would tell Africa is this. In 2025, my charge to Africa is Africa should reposition to recover. That is the title, or probably my code for Africa. Let me use it that way. Is reposition to recover. Africa needs to really reposition to recover, because some of these initiatives that are coming, if Africa did not reposition themselves, effective utilization of the opportunity to maximize the gains will not actually be there in the first place. When we are talking of solar energy, it has to do, or there's a relationship between irrigation farming, and solar energy. There's a relationship between poultry farming, and solar energy. There's a relationship between livestock farming and solar energy. So we need to start identifying where we can actually maximize these opportunities that will come into Africa. And in terms of food security, they are not just promising collaboration with Africa in terms of food security alone. They have also looked at insecurity that is actually bedeviling all the efforts that is being put by African governments to make sure that food security is being tamed. Because you see a lot of people, energetic population, wanting to go to farm, but they cannot do this at the detriment of their lives. So China is also coming to also help African continent in terms of collaboration with the military, training and retraining, come with gadgets that can also help fight insecurity. And I think it is high time the African continent take advantage of these initiatives to be able to maybe tame or minimize insecurity in Africa. So China is also ready to come with some security architecture that will also guide their own investments and also guide the investments of the African continent as well as the people in Africa. Because it is when we have people that we also talk of farming. And when we have farming, we also need people for consumption. So they are not just coming to invest alone this time. So the bilateral relationship or the bilateral agreements has to do with concerns of insecurity. And I think it's high time Africans were able to look at it critically. Then we position ourselves to see how we can recover, leveraging the benefits that comes with these additional credits, and investments by Chinese investors that is going to take place from first quarter, majorly, of 2025. Thank you very much.
All right, interesting submission there. We're not done yet. We're still looking at the debt crisis in Africa and what needs to be done to ensure that this situation doesn't lead to social unrest, as claimed by the United Nations Secretary General. Well, it's time for us to go on a break now. When we return, we'll continue our conversation with our guest, who is still much available with us. Stay with us. Fidelis, I hope you can hear me now.
Go ahead. Yes.
Now, still making reference to the statement credited to the United Nations Secretary General. Now, there was something peculiar he also said at this summit, which he described the international financial system as unfair, unjust. I would like you to react to this statement. Apart from the debt crisis in Africa, he's also calling for some reforms when it comes to the international financial system globally. He described it to be very unfair, especially when you look at protecting the interest of developing countries. I would like you to shed light on the statement credited to the UN Secretary General, describing the international landscape as unfair and there's a need for deep reforms. How do you react to this?
Yes, this is actually a very welcome development, because if you look at the the borrowing landscape, the need for reform is actually very needed. Because if you look at the conditions that have been, or probably that are always put forward for African and or developing economies to take some of these facilities, it's just that sometimes they are left with zero or no option, and they have to take this facility because of the circumstances they find themselves. And then, if it is like that, it does not really going to speak well in terms of ability to utilize the funds effectively, then ability to make repayments accurately. Some of the conditions are not favorable, but because they have no option, as I said earlier, they have to take this facility. A typical example is the interest rates at which some of these facilities are being given to Africa. Then interest rates are so high, and these high interest rates, given the pattern of economies and productivity in Africa, ability to utilize these funds productively to make repayments, becomes very, very difficult. So interest rates needs to be looked into. Then collaterals also, they are things of concern. Instead of African countries mortgaging their critical assets, why can't the facilities or the support be given in such a way that some of these critical assets are not being used? That is why there is this assertion or statement on the streets that China's are actually targeting African critical assets ownership by giving them the kind of facilities that they may not be able to make repayments, and at the end of the day, they take over their critical assets. But they have refuted that on several forums, and at several events, that is actually not the target of the China to take over African continent. And I think if Africans work very well, it will be difficult for their critical assets to be taken over by the Chinese government if the loan has been or is being utilized very well, and then the repayment is actually being done accurately. So tying some of these facilities to critical assets in Africa is also another challenge, because it actually it gives phobia in the first place that if we don't make these repayments, our assets can actually be taken. So it's actually not a very good condition. Even if it's going to come up like that, facilities should be given in a bilateral way, whereby the African continents will have a role to play. It could be like a commitment on their part, in terms of maybe it could be capital commitment. Then they need to de-emphasize on critical assets, because what we are seeing in this bilateral agreement and the summit that is recently held is that, okay, instead of tying some of these loans to critical assets, of Africa, which is part of the reform you mentioned, why can't Chinese investors come into Africa, come up with businesses here, employ our people, add value to whatever that is being produced here, or that is being processed here rather. Do that is importation of raw materials from African countries. So the kind of relationship we're having now, based on the summit, is that the investors are coming in to embark on what we call semi-processed goods now, or materials as the case may be, before it's being exported into China from African continent. And by so doing, there's value addition to it, and then there's a contribution to GDP that will come from that. Then there's also going to be employment generation that will come from that. So these are the kind of financing models that we need to look into, that is more contemporary, that will make it easy for Africa to be able to pay their loans, compared to when a facility is being given to them and then you are just there watching over them, irrespective of how the facility is being utilized, and that is what is actually making them find it difficult to embark on this repayment. So the reform of lending globally, the policies around lending globally, most especially to developing economies, has to be looked into. And I think it's a good thing that it has been taken upon, because we are looking at root cause analysis. Root cause analysis in the sense that, yes, they are finding it difficult. What is making them not to be able to repay their debts? I think it is the way the facility, the support is being packaged. And by the time it is being looked into, you discover that the support, the facilities, the finance support that are going to get, the African continent will get, will no longer come with just the money alone, but it will come with other value addition that can trickle down to economic growth that will give the African continent via increased productive capacity to be able to pay their loans. But one thing that baffles me in the summit is the issue of corruption was not talked about. The issue of corruption, I expected it to be on the front burner, because corruption leads to mismanagement of resources. Funds are being given to African countries, and you can see how African countries are actually spending in terms of governance. It doesn't show that the African countries needs money to invest. It shows they have money. So the pattern of spending of African countries, mismanagement of resources, corruption, these are some of the issues I expected should be brought on the front burner during the summit to be discussed openly, so that the African leaders can also know the consequences of what these points or what these concerns that I've mentioned has on an investment. Because in conventional banking, once a particular company takes a facility from the commercial banks, for example, and the facility goes bad, what is expected is recovery. Nobody will say, okay, because the facility has gone bad, okay, let's give you additional money, additional facility to be able to improve your production capacity to make repayments. It is not done in most cases. But the only thing you can find there is what? Restructuring. Restructuring in the sense that, okay, what is the repayment period? Okay, is it 3 years? Okay, let's extend it to 4 years so that the repayment amount can reduce, then it will now be easy for company A that actually took loan to be able to make repayment. Then the advisory role again that is supposed to be played or will be played by the commercial banks in terms of looking at that company A that took facility where they actually got it wrong. So what I'm saying in that sense is, it is just because of the win-win relationship that China wants from Africa. And I can also say that because of the little pushback of US order on global space that China also wants to achieve, that is why they are coming up with this pattern or this model. And I think it is high time we looked at the model. The African leaders need to look at this financing model that has been discussed. Look at the interest rates, look at the conditions where necessary to be adjusted. They can adjust as well to see how it can be favorable for African countries. But just as I said earlier, looking at root cause analysis, the issue of corruption, mismanagement, and then flamboyant governance needed to be discussed, and then it is supposed to also come to the public media, so that we can also know that yes, these things was discussed over there, because these are some of the things that are
Could the
leading to
avoidance
issues.
of the subject of corruption be as a result of the summit believing that Africa has as a duty to go back home and tackle its internal issues? But even though it was avoided, the open discussion of corruption issues in Africa avoided openly, but there seemed to be an implied discussion of it when the UN chief actually said that Africa has no access to effective debt relief. Now, why would they say that Africa has no access to effective debt relief? Let's also look at the issue of debt restructuring, which African nations have been advocating for quite some time now. So the G20 came up with a structure called the Common Framework, which so far Zambia sometime in June became the first country to actually have their debt restructured after failing to meet their debt obligations for 3 years. What are the issues here with Africa being able to actually get debt relief?
All right, thank you very much. When I was talking about corruption and mismanagement of resources, the creditors are watching. They are seeing what we have in terms of resources. They are seeing what we are doing with these resources. If we don't manage our resources effectively and efficiently, and we mismanage it, and we are coming for debt relief, it is not going to be possible. I know you have money, but you don't want to pay, either because you have mismanaged these funds, or you have invested these funds in critical projects in your country. That is actually shrinking your pocket from paying these funds. But when we are seeing flamboyant life in Africa, where we are seeing corruption in Africa, whooping sum of billions of naira being carted away by single individuals, funds that can be used to make this repayment, how can you come for debt relief and it will be granted? It will not be granted. And and what is expected there is a fiscal discipline. If African countries can embark on fiscal discipline to manage their resources very well, minimize corruption, it will be easier for them to embark on their commitment in terms of loan repayments. But with what we are doing, where single individuals are carried away with billions of naira, they are looking at us that if we really redefine and look inward, embark on fiscal discipline, we'll be able to pay our obligations. Not just that we don't have this money, but our resources and African resources is not effectively managed. So that is why I'm still emphasizing that there should be a forum where we discuss this with African leaders. Let them know that yes, even with what they have, they can also tinker with the economy and be able to come up with a substantial growth in terms of GDP. So it's not as if we are very poor, but what is happening in Africa is just mismanagement of resources and corruption. So with all this, nobody will actually grant that debt forgiveness. But what Africa needs to do now is just to go back home and see how they can re-strategize, to look at the areas where we are having leakages, to see how those leakages can be blocked, for us to have additional funds to be able to meet up with the local demands, in terms of economic, social activities, and also to be able to meet up with our loan commitments. So Africa needs to really look inward to see how what I have mentioned can be discussed. But I'm looking out for a forum where African leaders are gathered for us to, or for probably for issue of this corruption, mismanagement of resources can be discussed, because if this is not being discussed, you see diversion, of resources meant for a particular project that is supposed to alleviate poverty, goes into a pocket of some individuals or some cartels in the country. And that is what is leading to social unrest, unmet needs, unmet basic needs. If we have unmet basic needs of people in African continents, it will lead to social unrest. And if all these diverted funds from corruption, can be used to actually handle our local needs or to meet our local needs, you will discover that every single penny we take in terms of loan can be channeled into productive venture, productive enterprise, and it will be able to yield expected gains that will give us leverage to be able to make loan repayments. So as I said earlier, it will be difficult for African leaders to have debt forgiveness, except if it is very, 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 very necessary. Because our lifestyle, our governance does not depict a continent that is willing, or that should be giving debt forgiveness, because we have resources, we are mismanaging them, and then we are asking for debt forgiveness. It is not going to be easy, except if it becomes very pertinent, most especially life-threatening, that some African countries can have such opportunity to have debt forgiveness. Thank you.
Charity begin from home. This Bible says that charity begins at home. Now, if Africa's charity is going to begin at home, what are some of the things that should take place? Will that include having a central bank, the African Central Bank, which some have advocated for, and believe will also be like a middle gap between African nations when it comes to borrowing and the issue of debt management? What are some of these little things that needs to be done to ensure that the debt management crisis in Africa is, if absolutely not over, it's well efficient in the way that the borrowing can also justify what is meant for? Talk to us about the issue around Africa Central Bank, if that will make or play any role in debt crisis management or external borrowing in Africa.
All right, thank you very much. It's actually a way to charge African Central Bank to redouble their effort in terms of coming up with necessary KPIs for proper monitoring and evaluation. The funds, the bilateral relationship or agreements that is being embarked upon is not just only for a particular country. It is a fund that is being taken by the entire continent and is being signed by the entire continent. And as such, the African Central Bank should have a way to also manage these funds, to also monitor these funds rather. They should have their meetings, they should have their oversight function in terms of monitoring and evaluation, to be able to monitor some of these facilities that is being given to African continent. If possible, they can also have a sinking fund account where African countries can also maybe every month, quarterly, as the case may be making some repayments. Be making some savings into the sinking fund account, whereby when it is time for loan repayment, if probably the particular country is buoyant enough to make repayment from the coffers, they'll be able to make repayment from their coffers without going into that sinking fund account. That account is like a reserve account. When they have boom, for example, something should go into that account. Not that when they have boom, everything is being spent, and then when there are crises, they find it difficult. So the need for monitoring and evaluation from African Central Bank is actually very needed in this contractual agreement. Then the need for African Central Bank to also come up with initiatives, that can come as a rescue or a buffer is also very there. So I'm actually advising that African Central Bank should quickly come up with initiatives that will guide some of this, or that will guide the facilities that have been taken, and even the
Mr. March Fidelis Tabor, development economist and banking expert, for looking at the issue of debt crisis in Africa, as the UN chief is warned that debt crisis in Africa could be a recipe for social unrest. We do hope that African leaders will sit together and find a way to resolve this issue, do all that is necessary to improve governance in Africa.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.